They called him crazy the first time he answered a tree, not because he was loud, not because he disrupted anything, but because he spoke back, softly, calmly, to a tall oak behind the school cafeteria, as if it had whispered something only he could hear. His name was Micah, and he wasn't new to the whispers. He had been listening since he was 5. At first it was just rustling leaves, then patterns, rhythms. Eventually he understood when a branch was asking for sunlight, and when a trunk was mourning a fallen limb nearby. He tried to explain it once in 2nd grade. He said the trees were alive, not just biologically, but emotionally. They remembered things, they responded. His teacher smiled like he had told a bedtime story. Other kids didn't smile. They laughed, and that laughter followed him from hallway to hallway, all the way into high school. By the time he turned 14, Micah had stopped trying to explain. He walked home through the woods every day, not because it was faster, but because there at least he could be understood. Among the sycamores and elms, his silence wasn't strange. It was fluent. But then something changed. One morning he came home with a scrape across his cheek. A cut, he said, happened when a branch jerked out on its own. His mother asked if he tripped. He didn't answer. 2 days later, the fire alarm at school went off without anyone pulling it. Micah was found outside, standing beneath a willow tree, whispering something with his eyes closed. They suspended him for suspected vandalism. But that wasn't the end of it. It was the week after the incident, when he sat in detention for something he couldn't prove he hadn't done, that things took a darker turn. Because during that silent hour, the tree just outside the classroom window started to move, even though the air was completely still. And Micah was smiling. Micah wasn't a loud kid. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't throw tantrums like the others in the problem section of homeroom. He was just still, too still. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't laugh when others cracked jokes. And when the class was too noisy, he'd gently place his palms over his ears, not like he was in pain, but like he was tuning something out, something no one else could hear. Most teachers dismissed him as another quiet black boy with emotional processing delays. That's what they wrote in the files. Doesn't engage. Possible trauma. Behavioral observation recommended. But none of them ever asked Micah what he was actually listening to. Ms. Hargrove, his biology teacher, was the only one who noticed his notes. Micah always took them by hand, always in cursive, and always filled the margins with sketches of tree roots, leaf veins, branching diagrams, some so detailed they looked like pages torn from an old field journal. She once asked him where he learned to draw like that. He said he didn't learn, he just copied what he saw. "What you see in nature?" she asked. Micah shook his head. "What they show me," he said. She never asked what they meant. She didn't want to know. It was easier for her and everyone else at that school to believe Micah was strange than to believe he might be right. Easier to pathologize a quiet black kid than admit he might be listening to something the rest of them had forgotten how to hear. There was an unspoken rule at that school. The stranger the child, the faster they got boxed. And boxes were built faster for kids like Micah. So, when the oak outside the detention room moved on a windless day, no one saw it. But they saw Micah's smile, they saw his calm, and they saw fear in what they couldn't explain. There weren't many black kids at Briar Glen Middle School. It wasn't said out loud, but it didn't need to be. You could see it in the lunchroom, where Micah always sat alone, not just because of his silence, but because there was no table he fit into. He wasn't cool enough for the athletes, not weird enough to be quirky, and too quiet to be invited by the white kids whose parents chaired the PTA. Micah knew the feeling of being watched without being seen. He felt it when the school counselor tilted her head sideways every time he spoke, as if trying to decode a language she didn't trust. He felt it in the hallway when one of the gym teachers muttered, "Must be autism or something." Not realizing Micah was just 2 lockers away, he felt it in the staff meetings his mom was never invited to, because everything seems under control. Micah didn't mind being alone, not really, because the trees never made him feel like he had to explain himself, not once. That afternoon, 3 days after the detention incident, he went back to the oak behind the school, not to talk, just to listen. He placed his hand against the bark, warm, too warm, like the tree had a fever. He didn't flinch. He just closed his eyes, leaned in, and whispered, "Where does it hurt?" There was no voice, not the way humans speak. But something stirred deep inside the trunk, a low vibration, almost like a growl trapped inside wood, and then a word. Not said, but felt. Buried. Micah stepped back. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but the word didn't come from him. He knew that. The next morning, construction crews came to dig a trench near that same tree. They were laying new piping for the science wing. By third period, one of the workers collapsed. No clear reason, just dropped to the ground, clutching his stomach. By fifth period, they halted the entire project. Toxic exposure. Something had been leaking underground. No one thought to thank the kid who stood by that tree every afternoon, whispering things no one wanted to believe. Instead, the school called another meeting. Micah's mum sat across from the white principal and the pale-faced vice-counselor, who slid a piece of paper across the table. "We believe a different environment might better suit his unique sensitivities." That was the phrase they used. Micah's mom didn't sign it. Not that day. She walked out of the room with the same silent fury she'd carried for years, the kind of rage that comes not from surprise, but from knowing exactly how this story goes. That Monday afternoon, while the rest of the school was packed inside for indoor lunch due to the rain, Micah didn't ask for permission. He simply slipped out through the side door of the library, where no one really watched the cameras, and made his way to the edge of the woods. Not the deep forest, just the fringe where the trees leaned in like they wanted to listen. He walked in slow, familiar steps, hands in his hoodie, lips moving already, not talking for anyone to hear, but the roots and the branches. He told them about the substitute teacher, who mispronounced his name 5 times and then gave up. He told them about the way the hallway always seemed louder when he walked through it, like every conversation somehow got sharper when he passed. He didn't need pity, he didn't want fixing, but he wanted someone or something to hear him without filing it into a folder labeled behavioral concern. Micah placed his palm flat against the bark of an old hickory, his favorite. That tree had a split right down the middle, like a mouth frozen mid-sentence. He closed his eyes and whispered something he hadn't told anyone, a thought that had been growing like a bruise. Maybe I'm not supposed to be here, maybe I belong somewhere else. Then it happened again. That same hum, not a sound exactly, more like a vibration, a stirring in the soles of his feet, a low resonance in the bones of his hands. He stepped back, staring at the bark, and there, he swore it, the grooves in the wood shifted, ever so slightly. The knot in the trunk moved downward like it blinked, and somewhere from deep inside, a rustling, not from the wind, not from any bird or squirrel, but like a breath being drawn through leaves that weren't supposed to breathe. Micah didn't run. He never did, because for all the weirdness, all the times he'd been laughed at for it, those moments, those pulses from the trees, were the only times he ever felt completely real, like something was listening, like something was answering. But back in the school office, a teacher had noticed he was gone, and the wrong people were about to start asking the wrong kind of questions. They always asked that question like they didn't already know the answer. The call came in at 1:14 p.m. Mr. Lanson, the assistant principal, was eating his second protein bar behind a cracked laptop screen when the library aide voice hit the intercom, nervous, high-pitched, too fast. "He's gone again," she said. "Micah, the boy from 8B, he's not at his table. I think he went out. Toward the woods." That was all it took. 2 staff members were dispatched. A resource officer was alerted. One of the gym teachers, a broad man with a clipboard and a history of talking over kids who didn't talk much, muttered something about troublemakers always finding new ways to act out. And behind it all was that same look, the same low-lying suspicion that always crept in when the quiet kid wasn't where he was supposed to be. And the quiet kid was black. No one called his mother. No one asked if he might have needed a break, or if something about the building had been too loud, too sharp, too much. Instead, they filed out in a straight line like hunters following a rustle, convinced that whatever he was doing, it had to be stopped. Because boys like Micah didn't wander into the woods for reflection. They didn't meditate. They didn't commune. They ditched. They loitered. They acted out. As they crossed the muddy schoolyard, Mr. Lanson kept glancing at the trees like they were part of some crime scene, and in a way, they were, but not the kind of crime he imagined. Not the kind with chalk outlines and broken fences. The crime had started long before, in meetings where kids like Micah were described as non-compliant, in teacher huddles where his name always came with a sigh, in every moment someone looked through him instead of at him. They found him sitting on the slope just behind the far edge of the field, knees to his chest, hand pressed against a cedar tree that leaned slightly left, like it had bent toward him over the years. He wasn't doing anything dramatic. No carving, no fire, no destruction. He was whispering. The officer called out his name with that clipped tone adults use when they want obedience more than answers. Micah turned slowly. He didn't look scared. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, as if he'd known they would come. As if he had hoped. Maybe this time they wouldn't. They told him to stand up. He did. They asked what he was doing. He said he was listening. To what? They asked. Micah's eyes drifted to the tree, then back to them. To someone who doesn't talk over me, he said. That line stayed with Mr. Lanson for a long time. Not because he understood it, but because he didn't. And something about that made him nervous. They escorted him back in silence. No one touched him, but the space around him felt like a rope. Micah didn't resist. But as he walked, the leaves above them stirred, not with the breeze because the air was still, but in a wave. One after another, from tree to tree, as if the forest was watching, and remembering, and back in the building, in the staff room with flickering fluorescent lights and wrinkled lunch bags, someone whispered the words that would ignite the next part of the story. What if he's not just making it up? Miss Hargrove didn't mean to cause anything. That's what she'd say later, over and over, when the district called, when parents started emailing, when the board asked if she had followed protocol. But that morning, standing by the copier with her coffee still too hot to sip, she made a decision that would stretch far beyond the 4 beige walls of Briar Glen Middle. She slipped Micah's folder into her bag, not the whole file, just the page with his science notebook samples, and one of the behavioral forms marked Pattern of Environmental Withdrawal, Possible Auditory Hallucinations. That line made her flinch every time. It wasn't that she thought he was broken, quite the opposite, but she had seen something in that boy she couldn't shake, not a disorder, not defiance, something old, something careful, a kind of listening she hadn't seen in anyone since her grandmother, an herbalist from the Louisiana backwoods, used to kneel by trees and call them by names no one else knew. That afternoon, she emailed an old colleague, a field ecologist she had met years ago at a teaching conference. She attached the scanned pages with a note. I know this sounds strange, but you might want to look. The kid isn't pretending. She didn't expect a reply. She didn't expect anything, really, but she did expect to be discreet. The problem was, the email wasn't discreet for long. Within 48 hours, that note had been forwarded, then forwarded again. From a field researcher in Oregon to a biologist in Vermont to someone with a hyphenated last name and a TED Talk on plant sentience with over 1 million views. And somewhere along the line, the subject line changed from student question to potential anomalous cognition in juvenile case. Meanwhile, Micah knew none of this. He went to school the same way he always did, eyes lowered, notebook tight in his hands, hoodie sleeves pulled over his wrists. But something had shifted in the air. He could feel it. Teachers paused longer when he passed. Students whispered in smaller clusters. And during homeroom, the intercom buzzed twice without saying anything. That kind of silence had weight. At lunch, he sat under the maple behind the gym, same spot, same hush, and waited for the tree to speak, but it didn't. Not because it couldn't, because it wouldn't. And Micah, for the first time, felt something like betrayal from the one place that had never failed him. He didn't know yet that the forest had gone quiet, not out of fear, but out of warning. Something was coming. Something that spoke louder than trees. Something that didn't listen. Only studied, only categorized, only claimed. Back inside, in the school's administrative inbox, a new message had just arrived from an external address. It was marked urgent. Subject, Re, the boy who listens to trees. Dr. Sterling arrived 2 days later. She didn't wear a lab coat, but she might as well have. The way she walked through the school halls, clipboard clutched to her chest, eyes scanning every wall like it might hold data, made it clear. She was here for analysis, not conversation, observation, not understanding. She had a doctorate in cognitive ethnobotany, whatever that meant, and 3 articles published on the neuro-linguistic patterns in plant-human interaction. But none of that mattered to Micah when she walked into the classroom, because to him, she looked exactly like every other adult who'd come with a smile that said, "I'm not here to hurt you," but eyes that calculated angles and reactions before he even spoke. They pulled him from science class. I didn't ask. Just said, "Micah, could you come with us?" There were 2 of them. Dr. Sterling and a district supervisor, whose badge swung just enough to remind everyone who paid whom. They brought him to the conference room with the fake plants in the corner and the big window that didn't open. Sat him down across from a tape recorder. Asked if he could describe what he experienced when near trees. Micah didn't answer, not at first. Because the words they used weren't the words he would have chosen. Experience, sensory perception, auditory trace. They made it sound like a condition, like something they could isolate and label, and maybe medicate. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Quietly, deliberately. "I don't hear voices," he said. "I feel meaning." They scribbled that down. Then they asked, "Do the trees ever tell you to do things? Do they use words in English? Do you feel special when they speak?" And Micah sat there, not answering anymore, because he realized something he hadn't before. They weren't here to believe him. They were here to own whatever he said. When they left, they thanked him for his time, said they were fascinated and told him he was brave. But when the door closed behind them, Micah stared at his hands, hands that had always known how to find warmth in bark, how to listen with skin and breath instead of ears. And for the first time, he didn't know if he should ever touch a tree again. Because the wrong kind of attention didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like being dissected while still breathing. Monique Daniels never liked that school to begin with, not because of its test scores or its funding or even the teachers. It was the walls, the way they echoed when she walked through them, like her footsteps didn't belong, like they were too heavy, too sure. And when she came in for parent meetings, she noticed how often people used the word concern around her child. Not gifted, not insightful, not curious, concerned. About what, they never really said. They just frowned in that soft, polite way that white people did when they didn't want to say too much, but wanted you to hear everything. So when she got the call that a research professional had pulled Micah from class to ask him questions about trees, without so much as a signed permission slip, something inside her snapped. She didn't take the front entrance. She parked crooked in the loading zone and marched straight through the side door like she had every right to. And she did. Because when the world starts poking at your child like he's some strange exhibit behind glass, you don't ask for an appointment. You show up. By the time she reached the front office, the receptionist had already buzzed the principal. "He's in a meeting." "He's about to be in another one," she said, not stopping. And when she entered that room and saw the 2 strangers in business, casual, sitting across from her son with notes about his behavioral patterns and environmental fixation, she didn't sit down. She stood behind Micah, one hand on his shoulder, not to control him, but to anchor him, and said in a voice that didn't shake, "He's not your study. He's my son." Dr. Sterling opened her mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to deflect, but Monique didn't give her the space. "Whatever you think you're learning here, whatever papers you plan to write or grants you think you'll pitch, you will do it without him. You don't get to poke at his spirit just because you don't understand it." She turned to the principal. "You should have called me. The second someone outside the staff asked him questions, you should have called." The room fell quiet. And in that stillness, Micah tilted his head, just slightly, like he was listening again, but not to the trees this time. To her, his mother. The only person who had ever spoken like the earth was under her feet, and the sky had her back. Dr. Sterling closed her notebook, slowly, silently. And as she left the room, Micah whispered something to himself. His mother didn't ask what it was, because she trusted it wasn't for her to hear. Ms. Trent had never believed in anything she couldn't explain with a spreadsheet. She liked schedules, compliance reports, attendance graphs. She wasn't cruel, but she was organized to the point of suspicion. The kind of person who believed silence in a classroom meant control, and questions from a student meant distraction. especially if that student was quiet, especially if that student was black. Micah had always unnerved her a little, not because he was rude, he wasn't, not because he was behind, he wasn't that either. It was because he had a presence she couldn't quantify, like something was always turning in his head just out of reach. He didn't fidget, he didn't act out, but when he walked past her office, she could swear the air felt different, like the temperature dropped half a degree. So when she was asked to supervise him during a short detention, something about inappropriate use of outdoor space again, she said yes, mostly because she wanted to observe him. Quietly. Closely. They sat in the empty music room. The clock ticked. Micah didn't speak, just stared at the windows where, beyond the glass, the wind moved through the trees like fingers sifting through secrets. Then something happened. She heard it. It didn't come through the window, it wasn't in her ears. But it was there, a wordless rhythm, a kind of knowing. It felt like someone speaking beneath language, not to her exactly, but near her, around her. She sat up, adjusted her glasses, told herself it was nothing, but when she glanced at Micah, he was already looking at her, calm, unshaken, like he'd been waiting for her to realize she wasn't alone in the silence anymore. She stood, mumbled something about needing to check her emails, left the room without logging the end time. That night, in her apartment, she couldn't sleep. She tried reading, cooking, even scrolling through an article titled "Debunking the Myth of Tree Communication." But the words wouldn't stick, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, sitting perfectly still. And behind him, no, around him, an entire forest that didn't rustle or creak but breathed. She didn't tell anyone, not the principal, not the science department, not her sister, who thought everything she did was weird enough already, but she bought a houseplant the next day and found herself apologizing to it when she knocked it over by accident, just in case. There was no announcement, no press release, no official meeting with parents. It began with something far more mundane, an internal memo from the district superintendent's office. Subject line, "Unusual behavioral reports, containment strategy proposal." It wasn't about Micah by name, it never was, but everyone knew who it meant. The document suggested revisiting eligibility criteria for specialized educational environments and limiting access to open campus zones for students exhibiting consistent, unstructured outdoor behavior. Behind all the language, the intent was simple. Move him. Silence him. Hide what makes people uncomfortable. By Monday, the school had new security procedures in place. Certain exits remained locked during lunch. The grove behind the gym, Micah's sanctuary, was marked off-limits due to soil instability. Teachers received revised talking points about nurturing curiosity while maintaining structure, and most of them followed it without protest because challenging the system felt harder than just obeying it. But not all of them. Ms. Hargrove saw the new fencing and stopped mid-step. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. When she pushed harder, she was told that perhaps her emotional investment in certain students was clouding her professional judgment. She didn't respond. She just looked out the window past the barricade and whispered something under her breath that sounded a lot like an apology. Micah noticed the change too. Not just the fence, the tone. Whispers grew sharper, smiles more brittle. The space around him began to shrink like the school itself was folding in on him. He stopped writing in his notebook during class, stopped going outside during recess. Something in him began to curl inward, quiet, cautious, waiting. But the trees, they didn't fall silent, in fact they grew louder. Every night as he lay in bed he heard them. Not words but rhythms, cadences, urgencies, as if they were warning him, not of danger to come, but of something already happening, something rooted deep in the soil beneath every building and hallway that pretended it was neutral. And in the dark, Micah didn't cry. He didn't panic. He simply listened, because that was all he had ever been asked not to do. Zoe Miller was never the loud one. Her name always came last on attendance sheets. Her desk was always near the back, her hair half-tied, her binder half-empty. She wasn't invisible, but she wasn't seen. People assumed she was just another quiet kid, drifting beneath the noise of school life, but Zoe listened to things no one else thought were worth hearing. Lately she had noticed Micah shrinking, not physically but in presence. He used to glance at the trees through the windows like they were calling him. Now he looked through them like they weren't even there. He didn't doodle in his notebook anymore. His hands, always sketching veins of leaves or circles around knots of bark, now sat flat, still. Zoe didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask anyone. But during lunch, while most kids laughed too loud over lukewarm pizza, she quietly collected details. Who walked by Micah's desk and muttered something? Who stared too long? Who sat too far? She saw the changes, not because they were loud, but because they were quiet in a different way. And she understood that kind of quiet. Then one day, behind the gym, where the trees were fenced off and the sign said restricted due to erosion, Zoe found Micah sitting alone, tracing the outline of a root that had cracked the concrete. She walked over, not fast, not slow, and stood beside him. "I hear them too," she said, not smiling, not dramatic. Just a fact laid on the table. Micah looked up. He didn't flinch, but something in his posture shifted. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have to. "Not like words," Zoe continued, "but like they're paying attention, like they know when someone's listening." Micah stayed quiet, but after a moment he reached into his backpack and pulled out the battered notebook. He opened to a page, not at random, one he had drawn and redrawn so many times it looked like a map. Not to a place, but to a pattern, to a logic that only made sense if you felt it. Zoe didn't ask to see more. He handed it to her anyway. And for the first time since the fences had gone up, since the questions had turned cold, Micah saw something different in someone's eyes. Not fear, not curiosity, but recognition. That afternoon, they didn't talk about the school or the staff or the rumors. They sat, shoulder to shoulder, just close enough for stillness to feel like presence, because knowing someone believes you, even without understanding you, can be louder than any accusation. The intercom crackled during third period. It wasn't the usual announcements about bake sales or late buses. It was a voice nobody recognized, flat and rehearsed, asking all students to remain in their classrooms. Teachers exchanged glances. Some locked their doors without asking why. Outside, the custodial staff, those who never wore security badges, were joined by two unfamiliar men in suits with laminated visitor passes. They didn't carry clipboards. They didn't smile. They carried silence with them, the heavy kind that follows decisions already made behind closed doors. Micah was pulled from class without explanation. Zoe stood up too, but was told to sit down. She didn't. Not right away. They took him not to the principal's office, but to a small windowless room in the admin building. One chair, one table, two adults who spoke in polished words that sounded like concern, but smelled like containment. They asked him questions he couldn't answer without lying. "Why do you think the trees speak to you?" They didn't ask if he was okay. They didn't ask what made him feel connected. They wanted him to admit it was all in his head. They wanted a diagnosis they could file, a reason they could write down and close off. Micah didn't respond the way they hoped. He didn't claim powers. He didn't confess to delusions. He simply said, "They listen when no one else does." One of the men sighed, audibly, like it was a chore to hear something he couldn't classify. The other checked his watch. They told him he'd be transferred, not expelled. Just a specialized setting, one with less outdoor access, fewer distractions, more structure. Micah didn't argue. He sat quietly, but he looked past them, not in defiance, not in fear, but with a gaze so steady it made both men shift uncomfortably. Back in the main building, Zoe wasn't sitting anymore. She had told 3 other students, then 5. By the end of the day, a dozen kids, none of them particularly popular, most of them invisible in their own ways, knew what was happening, and they all remembered moments Micah had noticed them when no one else did. Remembered when he had shared without judgment, listened without reward. They didn't chant. They didn't protest. They did something far more dangerous. They started listening too. That night, Micah sat in his room, packed bag beside him. Outside his window, the wind moved differently, erratic, urgent. The trees seemed to lean closer, not to comfort, but to remind him of something he already knew. They were not just reacting, they were preparing. Micah never returned to Briar Glen, but months later, the fence around the grove collapsed in a storm no one saw coming. Students found hand-drawn maps tucked into library books, routes traced in ink, notes written in margins, and one phrase whispered between kids who used to sit alone. If you listen long enough, they answer. No press covered it, no teachers mentioned it, but recess moved closer to the trees again. And the silence, the one they tried to build, never returned.